Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Now, I have to apologize today. My voice is a little bit scratchy. I blew it out at a football game last weekend. Grew up in Michigan. I'm a big Lions fan. We've had a pretty good year this year for the first time in a while. So I thought it would be fun to go see a big game at Lambeau Field. When they had a chance to win, and they did, it was great. Didn't make the playoffs like we'd hoped, but it's always fun to beat the Packers. And to you Packers fans, I apologize, but let's face it, you've beat up on my Lions plenty over the past few years. Okay, so enough of my personal explanation for why my voice is so scratchy. Let's take a look at today's topic. Okay, the new SmartRail Ethernet base. So this month is I/O month. We've got several topics we're going to cover, all I/O related. Some of our I/O topics last year were some of our most popular. For the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about this new SmartRail I/O base. And today, and for the next few weeks, we're going to have a special guest, somebody you know and love but haven't seen in a while. Let's bring him in now, Mr. Casey Gardner. How you doing, Casey?
Hey, not too bad. How's it going, Chuck?
It's doing great. I was just double checking your audio there. That looks good. So with this new SmartRail Ethernet base, what are you looking forward to? What are you most excited about with this new product?
Sure. I think part of the updated design is that we actually have a single base instead of the need for separate bases for different communication protocols as we have in the past. So that's kind of a really nice have one base to kind of rule them all kind of deal.
That's terrific. You know, being able to use the same part number or SKU to talk to a Horner OCS product or use it with a third-party PLC, that's pretty great. Now, one thing that's definitely been an issue in the market over the past couple of years is the fact that, you know, lead times and supply chain issues for remote I/O, especially Ethernet remote I/O, has been a problem. So what does the supply look like for this new SmartRail Ethernet base?
Sure. So we actually have about 200 to 300 units in stock currently, and we're still getting more shipments in as well. So we feel like we've got a supply for the foreseeable future.
Terrific. It's always nice when you can actually sell a new product that you've developed. These supply chain issues are always a challenge. Anything else that our customers should know about the new Ethernet I/O base?
Sure. One thing that we want to mention is that currently it does have an ordinary location UL approval. We are still working through the Class 1 Div 2 type approval, which is, again, on most of our products for that matter. But just wanted to make that clarification as well.
Okay, very good. So if you're using it like most people do in a traditional application, UL is available and ready to go. If you have a hazardous location, you have to wait a few months for that to kick in.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Casey. I appreciate it. And we'll see you again next week. Take care.
Of course.
All right. Let's dive into the topic for today. All right. Here's how we're breaking down the topic. We're going to do a quick reintroduction of SmartRail I/O for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. We'll talk about the different connectivity options as well as the I/O modules that are available for that family. We're going to compare the new SmartRail ETX 250 Ethernet base with the one we've been selling for the past several years. Now, that product has not been in stock for some number of months just because of the fact of these supply chain issues. But we've got this new model available, and we're excited to provide it to you. Then we're going to talk about how do you configure this new SmartRail base in Cscape, and there'll be plenty of demonstrations throughout. Let's dive right in. Okay, here's our review of SmartRail I/O. SmartRail is a family of remote and expansion I/O. It's one of our more popular I/O families. You start with an I/O base, which provides connectivity either to your Horner OCS All-in-one Controller or to your third-party PLC in the case of, let's say you've got a Rockwell PLC and you want to add Ethernet IP I/O. Now, once you've selected your I/O base, you can add up to 8 modules per base to complete one rack of I/O. If you're using this product with Horner OCS, you can have up to 16 racks of I/O per system or per network, actually. So it can really scale up to large-scaled I/O. Let's talk about the connectivity options again. If you're talking about connecting to a Horner OCS, your choices are CsCAN network, which is the most popular, Ethernet, which is what we're talking about today, and it's actually under the hood, it's actually using Modbus TCP. We've also got a CAN open base. So if you had an application where maybe you had to interface with a third-party motion controller over CAN open, and you wanted to hang SmartRail I/O off of that same network, you could use our CAN open base for that purpose. Now, if you're talking about a third-party connection, we've got Ethernet IP available, which is included in the new ETX 250 base. CAN open, as I've mentioned before, and also Profibus. So that one, for the most part, I think is pretty close to obsolescence. So that would probably only be something you'd order on a replacement basis. Let's talk about the modules now. Once you've selected a base, now you need to select one or more modules. So let's talk about what's in common with all the I/O modules. Well, they've got a backplane connector, which allows them to connect to the base and to each other. And all the modules are effectively isolated from the network. So that's very nice. You've got galvanic isolation between the field side and the backplane side. All the modules come with a removable I/O plug. By default, it's a screw type plug. And you do have the option of purchasing separately a spring clamp plugs as an accessory. Also, for all analog modules, you will need to run 24 volts DC to the front of each module. That's to maintain the isolation between the backplane and the field side. And as you'd expect, all modules have LEDs for showing module status, especially useful for digital modules. Let's take a look at the digital modules that are available, starting with the DC inputs. You've got 8, 16, and 32 point densities available. All modules are compatible with either 12 volt or 24 volt signals. And if you're talking about using the 32 point card, you will have to purchase extra accessories because it utilizes a high density IDC style ribbon connector. Those accessories are available from Horner, but also from companies like Phoenix Contact, for instance. Now on the DC output side, we've got 24 volt positive logic outputs available in 8, 16, and 32 point densities. The 32 point card is only 1/10 of an amp per point, whereas it's 1/2 amp per point for the lesser densities. And you need to land, of course, the 24 volt DC that is going to be running out to your actuators. That needs to be landed on the module's terminal strip, as you'd expect. Also available as a digital output are relay output cards in 8 and 16 point densities, supporting voltages all the way up to 250 volts AC. And these do require a little more backplane power than some of the other modules. So if you have an application with a lot of relay requirements, you may be limited to, let's say, 5 maximum relay output modules per base. That's one of the only restrictions from a power draw standpoint you'll find with SmartRail. Now, one thing I will mention also is that there is a DC in relay out module available that is pretty popular. Now, on the analog side here, all analog modules are 12-bit resolution. They're all available with either 4 to 20 milliamp or 0 to 10 volt signals, although when you're talking analog outputs, you do typically need to select the module that supports either voltage or current. And we do have a 2-in, 2-out mixed option, which is also very popular. Now, if you've got temperature sensors in your application, we support RTDs and thermocouples with an RTD input module and a thermocouple module, respectively, with 10th degree Celsius resolution, which is pretty decent. Okay, now let's do a little bit of a comparison between the new SmartRail base, the ETX 250, and the one we've been selling for a while, which is the ETX 200 and the ETX 300. Now, the ETX 200 is the one that customers have been using with the Horner OCS for years. The ETX 300 is the one that they've had to order if they're using it on an Ethernet IP application with a third-party PLC, for instance. So you've got 2 different part numbers that you have to deal with in that scenario. Now, we've replaced those 2 part numbers with the single ETX 250. And as Casey mentioned, that one part number replaces both of those. Now, taking a quick look at the front here, you can see they look quite a bit different. Now, they're still very similar in terms of functionality. They both have built-in Ethernet switches. They're both powered from 24 volts DC. They both have diagnostic LEDs. Now, the new base has some rotary switches that are there as a future potential feature. They're not really used in today's applications. And there's also a factory USB port on the front of the new base as well. Okay, let's take a quick video tour of the two modules side by side. Okay, let's compare the original SmartRail Ethernet base with the latest design here. So with the original, you've got the Ethernet base, or at least the built-in Ethernet switch, is recessed. Whereas on the new design, because there's more hardware included in the physical design, we weren't able to recess the ports that much on the switch. So what you can see here is instead, the ports are slanted down because they had to be mounted on top. We wanted to minimize the impact of the depth requirements there. Also on the original, you can see our 24-volt power here connector, which is a 3-position fixed connector. On the new design, instead, what we have here, of course, is we have a 3-position still, but it's removable. It's also spring clamp. So you can pull that power connector off without having to, unwire the connections, which is nice. From an LED standpoint, there's more diagnostic LEDs on the new design versus the old design. Here you can see on the old design and the new design, we've got more diagnostic LEDs available. And then a couple other things. First of all, we have a pair of rotary switches that are really just a future feature. For now, they should be left both pointing at 0, which is the factory default. And then another thing to be aware of is there is a USB port also here in the upper left-hand corner that's strictly for factory use at this point. It's possible we could enable that in the future for some sort of configuration function or something. But so far, that's strictly factory use only. Okay, so that's a quick look at the original SmartRail Ethernet base and our new hardware design for the ETX 250. Okay, and while nothing has really changed mechanically in terms of assembling SmartRail to the base, modules to the base and to each other, for those of you who are new to SmartRail, let's go ahead and go through that as well so you can see how everything just fits together. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about assembly, physical assembly of the base with the modules. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that this backplane connector is accessible. Now, when it ships from the factory, there's a plastic cover over this backplane port, so we just need to pull that off of there to make it available. And then we're going to assemble module by module. This is a 32-point module. And what we have to do is, as we add each module, the first one to the base and then module to module after that, we need to make sure that these latches are open. In other words, you don't see any white plastic at all through that window at the top or the bottom. Okay, so you can see some white plastic. So we got to move the latches to the open position so that hole is completely open. Okay, and then it's a matter of just aligning the module with the side of the base. And the key here is the squeeze. Okay, squeeze it and then move your latch from front to back for both latches. Okay, and now the module is affixed. Now, as you add each additional module one at a time, again, you need to make sure these latches are open. And then you add the module, squeeze, and then latch. Okay, so that's physical assembly of the SmartRail Ethernet with its modules. Okay, now let's talk about configuration in Cscape. Now, while the ETX 250 has the capability of being used either with the Horner OCS and configured in Cscape, or as a third-party or with third-party PLCs, for instance, today we're really focused on interfacing with the Horner OCS. Next week, we'll talk about how to interface it with third-party PLCs. So let's go through quickly on a slide basis what the procedure is for configuring the SmartRail Ethernet base in Cscape. So we start things out where you'd expect at the hardware configuration, and then we need to select the I/O tab for the port that we're going to be connecting the SmartRail to. So since this is SmartRail Ethernet, we're going to select one of the LAN I/O tabs. If we're using an XL4 or another single port Ethernet based module, then we're going to select the LAN 1 tab. If we've got, let's say, 2-port module, we'll select that. We select the appropriate I/O tab. Then we have to add our base. We fill in the base details, and I'm going to kind of gloss over this a little bit because I'm going to show you a hands-on demonstration here in a minute. We've got a number of things we need to fill in here. One of the things we have to fill in is the MAC address for the base if we want the OCS to configure its IP address over BootP. So you can find the MAC address from the label on the side of the new module. So once you've added the base and configured the base, then you start adding I/O modules. Once you've done that, any I/O module that needs extra configuration, you just double click on that module. And then when you're all done, you can take a look at where everything is mapped in the address, the memory addresses of the OCS. Okay, so here's a quick summary of that process. With this slide, you can freeze frame that here if you want to take a look at that. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and take a look at configuration of the ETX250 with a hands-on demonstration. Okay, let's demonstrate the configuration in Cscape for the SmartRail Ethernet base. All right, so we're going to start by going to Hardware Configuration. So I pressed the Hardware Configuration button. And the first requirement is we need to make sure that whatever Ethernet port we're going to be connecting our SmartRail I/O to, we need to make sure that the basic Ethernet configuration is performed. So at the very least, it means an IP address and a net mask, and those can either be hard-coded like I've done so here, or they can be variables and assigned somewhere on the touchscreen. So again, in my case, I have hard-coded them here. So this is the Ethernet configuration for the OCS that's going to be driving the SmartRail I/O. So once that's complete, now it's a matter of configuring the I/O itself. And the way that is done is you find the I/O tab for the Ethernet network that you're going to be connecting SmartRail to. So in my case, I'm using an XL4 to drive the SmartRail. It only has one Ethernet port, so I will select the LAN 1 I/O tab. If this were a 2 Ethernet port OCS product like an XL7 Prime or EXL10 or something, then I would have 2 tabs to choose from, LAN 1 I/O and LAN 2 I/O. But I'll go ahead and choose LAN 1 I/O here. And you can see I've previously added a base and 4 modules. Now, I'm configuring an ETX250. Don't be concerned that the graphic here shows ETX200 because from a Cscape standpoint, they are identical when you're connecting a ETX250 or an ETX200 to a OCS and configuring it in Cscape. And the benefit of them being identical from a Cscape perspective is in the future, if you had an ETX200 that you replace with an ETX250, then you don't have to swap out the module type or anything like that. Okay, let's take a look at the configuration that we've done for this ETX200. The base name is just whatever documented name you want to provide that base with. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. The base IP does need to be hard-coded, so that is hard-coded here. Now, if you want the IP address of the SmartRail base to be assigned by the OCS or to be configured by the OCS using BootP, then you'll select this checkbox, and then you need to put in here the MAC address for the specific I/O base that you're using in your project. And you can find that on the label of the ETX250. Okay, and that's entered in standard hex format. You should assign a status register. Now I'm using variable base advanced ladder, so I've selected a variable here. If you were using register base advanced ladder, you would just fill in a register address. Now here we need to configure the starting addresses for digital inputs, digital outputs, analog inputs, and analog outputs. Now, with register-based advanced ladder, you would type in directly the %I, %Q, %AI, and %AQ addresses here. So for instance, %I65, %Q65, %AI65, %AQ65. Now I'm using variable base advanced ladder, and I'm taking advantage of the real world IO arrays that are built into Cscape. And so because arrays are 0 based, my addresses here are 1 less than the appropriate %I address, for instance. So %I65 is the equivalent of I64. So that's why you see that. Okay, so that's the configuration for the base. After that, it's a matter of adding modules one by one. And then for any module that you add that requires any extra configuration, you can double click on the module and configure the details. So for instance, for this 4-channel analog input card, what is the data type? Or, are we talking about 0 to 10 volts, 4 to 20 milliamps, etc.? Which channels are enabled, because only the channels that are enabled will be scanned. And then what data range are you looking to be reported by the SmartRail IO modules? And then similarly, I have a 4-channel thermocouple card with some detailed configuration as well. Okay, now when I'm done, I can take a look at this More Info button here, and it'll show me the detailed IO map from an address perspective for each of the modules in my stack. So that is all that's required from a configuration standpoint. The next step would be for me to download this configuration to the OCS as part of my project in Cscape. And then at that point, after download, either everything is just going to immediately start communicating, or I may need to power cycle the system so that the OCS and the SmartRail base can get synced up the first time as the OCS assigns the IP address using boot P to the Ethernet IO base. But once that's complete, then we're good to go from that point forward. Okay, so that's a look at the Cscape configuration for the SmartRail Ethernet base. Okay, a couple more things, and then we'll show you a system working on the bench. Now, I mentioned during the configuration that there's a status variable that you should take advantage of. Mainly what you're looking for there is to make sure that it has a value of 0 at runtime, indicating everything is communicating properly. If it has a non-zero value, then you're going to want to see what's happening and get a clue as to maybe what the problem is. Also, the new base has a lot more LED diagnostics than the original model did. And in the user documentation, you can see all the details as to what the different states of the LEDs mean. But in general, what you're looking for is 4 green lights at the top, nice and solid, indicating everything is good. And then a couple of activity amber type LEDs flashing back and forth to indicate, again, that you've got communications activity happening. So now we've talked about all the different elements of setting up a system and all the status feedback. Let's take a look at a demonstration on the bench. Okay, let's take a look at our demonstration here on the bench now that our configuration has been downloaded to our OCS and everything is up and running. So what I've got going here is I've got my IO simulator here wired to the IO on the SmartRail, being driven, of course, by the new ETX250. My first Ethernet port here is actually connected to my PC that's running Cscape. So I'm taking advantage of the built-in switch here. And then the second Ethernet port is actually what's connected to the OCS. So this XL4 can drive this base full of SmartRail IO. So as you can see, we've got all green lights here. So everything's solid and running. We have activity lights flashing back and forth, and we can monitor the IO here from the XL4 using this demo that I've got here. So I'm going to go ahead and show you from an analog perspective. I can adjust my analog value here on my IO simulator. You can see that's being adjusted. I also have a temperature that I'm monitoring here on my Thermocouple input module, which is the 4th module in the stack. The analog module is the 3rd. And then I've got a 16-point DC input module here that's connected to inputs. You can see them turn on here on the top row, as well as here on the XL4. So I can adjust these, switch these inputs on and off. And then the next 4 inputs I have wired to the second module. You can see those turn on here. Okay. And then I have the ability to actually turn the relays on. This second module has 8 DC inputs and 8 relay outputs. So I can turn the relays on. You can hear the beep, maybe the click. Okay. And I've got 8 relays connected to the SmartRail, being driven, of course, by the OCS. And my USB port is only used in the factory. I've left the rotary switches at their default positions at 0. That's kind of a future feature we might take advantage of in the future. And that is a look at the SmartRail Ethernet base being driven by a XL4 in this case, but it could be driven by any Horner OCS. And that's your demonstration. Okay, so that's the new SmartRail Ethernet base. Any of you who've used our previous model will notice that very similar in every way except a newer hardware design, a design that we can actually supply because we have a good inventory of products, and we've made some nice improvements, especially the fact that with a single module, or single base, I should say, we can support both standard Horner Ethernet or Modbus TCP through a Cscape configuration or a third-party PLC connection as well. And as you're doing the configuration on the Horner side, if you want the OCS to configure the IP address of the SmartRail Ethernet base, you will need to note the MAC address that's printed on the label of the product as you're configuring in Cscape. So that's our program for today. We want to remind you that this is the 10-year anniversary in 2023 for Horner Lighting, and we encourage you to take a look at some of the lighting videos on our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of great products, regardless of your application, whether you're talking lighting on the factory floor, task lighting, you're talking, the types of lighting that you would do in an inspection type application, whatever the case may be. Also, we're here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Where you can watch us whether we're fully live or we're streaming live a pre-recorded video. And we encourage you to make comments and to ask questions either in the chat section if you're watching live or in the comment section if you are watching on replay. Now, next week, we're sticking with our new SmartRail Ethernet base, but it's going to be all about configuring and using this product and SmartRail Ethernet in general with a third-party system like a Rockwell PLC, for instance. So if you need to add additional remote Ethernet IP-based I/O to a third-party system, in the scenario where you have a customer who just isn't up to snuff and doesn't understand how great the Horner OCS is as a controller, if you have to use it with a Rockwell PLC, for instance, we'll show you how to do that. So if you haven't done so already, we'd encourage you to subscribe to our channel. It doesn't cost anything. And if you select notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. And remember, in 2022, that was well north of 100 video, including 50 of these live streams where we cover a new technical topic every week. Okay, hopefully next week, my voice will be in better condition. I apologize for sounding like a frog today. But until I see you again, let's all get out there and do us some good.